Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of Open Source Diaries, where we discuss how open source cuts across different careers and industries as well as occupational fields. And today we got a guest who is a researcher with years of experience in open source as well, who has worked in like notable organizations like Microsoft, Chaos, and so many other organizations. Good to have you here, Armstrong.
Thank you so much, Anita. It's my pleasure.
Um, so, Armstrong, I know so many persons that are currently doubting that you can get involved within open source as someone who is research oriented or as a research scholar. I figured that who would be a better person to actually lead this session than yourself. But first, before we dive in, can you just tell us a bit about yourself and how you got to where you are today with your background?
Thank you for this opportunity, Anita. And as you know, I'm Armstrong Foundjem. I actually am a researcher at the DEALS project. It's Dependable and Explainable Learning project at École Polytechnique in Montreal. Before joining DEAL, I've done a couple of works with open source right from my undergrad. I even remember when I started my undergraduate, I was selected to represent my university at a competition at Facebook Meta headquarters in Alta Paulo. And the project we worked in, GeoTrellis, was really an open source project. And that was really the beginning of my publicly contribution. Now, if you come back to the same question you asked, like relating open source and research, I think that is even the best place to do open source because research by definition is bringing your not just your result but how you got that result for public consumption. You are not doing research for yourself, you are doing it for others, you are doing it for humanity, and people need to understand how your conclusions were derived, how they could derive values, how they could replicate your work. And these are the core principles of open source. I will just try to play a little bit with this question to say my first involvement with open source was using the OpenBSD kernel, which is a variant of the Unix operating system. I was really involved with a lot of hacking, and I think that was just like the beginning of my journey in computer science. I played a lot with the variants of Linux, which were all open source. It gives me the flexibilities of understanding the kernel and working around. The first tools that I actually used was Emacs, which I'm still using today. It's fantastic for hacking and for many other productivity works. And besides that, the work we are doing right now, I'm just fast forwarding it to show you the timeline of how open source has really been the foundation, the pillar, and even the support system of my research and what I do. I also contributed a lot and work a lot with the open infrastructure, which is formerly the OpenStack Foundation. This is one of the best open source ecosystem you'll find on this planet Earth. I've done research with Linux kernel, with Apache Foundation. I've done research with so many others that I've even published works on. But there is something within the open infrastructure. I mean, things change over time. They have changes and things are happening. But the four opens that they operate on and many other factors within that community just set it apart as the place to be. Kubernetes is also a great place. I've looked upon all the communities to really see how ecosystems and ecosystem can be. And my work in particular has hugely focused on open source ecosystem. It is true that I have also looked at organizations such as Microsoft, such as Meta, such as you could say the Apple, which are all closed sources, but they still have some not hidden, but some latent properties that strongly support the open source movement. Yeah. So I think I may go into that in depth because the first question was really intense to touch on so many things, but I'll leave it for later on, later discussion.
Okay, so first off, impressive background, by the way. But like you mentioned earlier about how you started open source when it was like the Unix and all of that. And then I'm curious, right? How did you use or contribute to this project as at that time as a researcher?
Well, I was not a researcher at that level because to be a researcher, I mean, in the strict sense of it, you really need to have a grad degree that is oriented towards research. But I mentioned that I was still at the beginning of my journey at the undergrad, say year one. but I was really someone who loves curiosity, who loves to break things. I was playing a lot with a lot of stuff. And coming from a purely technical and kind of anthropological background in a mixture of things. My vision, I would say I was fundamentally a kind of philosophical person. I question things a lot to bring meaning out of them. That curiosity drove me into discovering things. At that level, I was not really contributing, but I was reaping the benefits of those who build those systems because I was still learning how to mount. Let's say I could put an antenna with some electronic circuit. I load some kind of drive, try to, play around with some signals and try to detect things. I was just doing some kind of hacking, I would say, but not a kind of breaking into people's space, but just like discovering how things work and how to invent things at the local level. So I was more of a consumer of this product at that level, understanding how the kernel works. Then later on, I really started like giving back as contribution. It was during my, I would say, the last year of my undergrad and when I started my master's degree, because that was really when I started working on projects that were open source and needed huge amount of contributions. So that early state was more of understanding what it was, the benefits, and how I can stretch out things. At that level, I would not say I was really at that level of giving back. Yeah.
Okay. So now, considering how much experience you've gathered over the years, right? How would you say open source specifically intersects with like scientific research?
As I introduced earlier, open source is the pillar, I will say, of doing research. No matter what research you are doing, it could be still in social sciences, it could be in any area. Now, when we look at open source, I'll give a little bit of example of some tools like ArcGIS. This is a highly important tool for people who are doing remote sensing, who are doing works around that area in geography and many others. And I mean, it's very good. But if you go to the proprietary product, I bet you will not even like to hear the price. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I work on an open source project at Meta. We were building a similar kind of a product which was open source. It gives this flexibility of collecting data in a transparent way. That's what open source does to research. It gives you this flexibility of collecting data in a very transparent way. So people can even verify that data and replicate your work. It gives you the direct accessibility of understanding the tools you are using, the libraries. For example, if I have to, let's say, write a code in C++ or in Python, Java, whatever language I'm using at the time, if I look at the way the library behaves, I can go into the source code and truly investigate if what I'm obtaining is not so. Yeah, so that flexibility, it gives some kind of accountability as well. Open source gives us this transparency in research, which is a core component. For example, I remember many years ago, that could be, if I'm not mistaken, the 2013, 2014, there was a study done in Canada, published that result, and Canadians swallow it as the gospel truth about their movement. And they were giving all sorts of recommendations which were like standard. Those things were done under closed doors environment and the results published. Close to 10 years later, one of the lead researcher, in short, the principal investigator of that project, came up openly on the national television and radio and announced that she's resigning from that project because she has been deceiving Canadians by lying about that research. That was so scary. I mean, it traumatizes me because I ask myself, now, how can we trust a government organization, an institution, or anybody? And all these things could easily happen because you just take people for who they are and trust them. I don't want to talk so much about trust because that's another thing that I'm working on, which is my direction of research. It's so complex. But just to tell you about the psychological components, when you build upon trust to somebody without even any measurable metrics to see if you're credible or not. Now, if somebody comes up like that in an open source world and publish a result, I bet you in less than 24 hours, like this, the capabilities we have in research now, somebody in China, in France, in Israel will replicate that study and start raising a red flag. That, hello, you publish something like this, but I cannot verify it. I'm having this result. Can you explain? So this transparency in open source, making the tools we use accessible to others, making our own data and explanation accessible to others, it gives a lot of accountability, which I think it is just the way to do research. And I will also say that there are many aspects of like the AI movement which is coming in. I will confess that it is also changing the way we used to know traditional open source, especially the open source software systems, because the debate is real. When I listen to key players like Joshua Benjo, when I hear his own version of the story, I hear people like Jan LeCun, kind of heated debate. Now, should we just release all the models and their weights to the public, or should we kind of, conceal something and make? So the definition of software, of open source software, has changed. And this change came from the AI component infiltrating, let's say, the current movement of AI, which is taking over the software open source systems. I am not totally against that change, but I'm just trying to say, as researchers, we will do our best, and I think researchers everywhere are trying to look into all these components to say whatever we make open should really give accessibility to people to understand the core components and how decisions are made. Yeah. So I will just give a short encounter. It has happened to me like 3 times, and all the 3 times I was so skeptical. And the third time I had to confront the officers. I traveled to UK once for a conference, and as we arrived, that particular batch of people that were passing through the airport security at that time, I was the only black. One lady just ran to me and said, "Oh, sir, we are doing a random search. It's very random, and you were selected for the search." It did not sit so well with me, but I could not stop an officer to doing their job. I just said, by curiosity, can you explain to me how your random seats were calibrated? Just to know how your randomness is decided upon. Not answer that question, and she just played around and said, it is the system. You submitted and they did the search. The second time this happened in the US, I told the officer, look, I've heard this over randomness and things. Just explain. I'm not refusing. How was it calibrated? Because the way you pop into me, just like you look upon all people, who were more than 20 standing on a group, and I'm the only one, and still I was the only black at that particular instant. I'm not making up any story that I was racially profiled. No, that's not what I'm saying. But the way they just barged into me, some room of suspicion, which I needed clarification. And the only clarification was to tell me how they calibrated their randomness seats, something like that. And they could not even explain any of these things. The third time it happened, I had to file a formal complaint, which actually gave a lot of credibility, because when I explained it, they took it so seriously, and they adjusted the system now to the best of my knowledge. The way we follow up the case, they try to redress some of the key components, how randomness should really be explained to people and things like that. Why am I saying so? We are dealing with a world where decisions will be taken by system, let's say AI systems. You will call a customer service, maybe you'll be speaking to a robot, and they will not tell you detailedly how the decision came about. You want to argue, they say this is the system. That's so dangerous. We need explainability. We need to know if you were selected for this particular competition or you were rejected. These are the criteria. Was gender one of the factors that they considered to make that decision? What percentage of gender was deliberated upon? Was your origin, let's say, from Africa or from Nigeria, Cameroon, or wherever part you are coming from in Africa? Was it a factor that contributed in that decision? What are the parameters? What metrics were used? We need to see this transparent. And these are the kind of things I really do with my research, to explain how decisions are made to contribute to the final outcome. So this kind of open source way of looking at things like research, I think this is just the way to go about it. Everybody will be pleased, even if you are rejected, and the criteria that were used for the rejection is transparent, is explainable and fair. Everybody will accept that with joy and see how they could do better things.
That's interesting, actually. And to see that maybe if the facts behind the randomness stated at the airports were actually made public, it would have been easy for you to just know that, oh, this is the protocol that they're following, and you are not just being racially profiled. And that does make draws me to like my second question, right? So like in terms of handling research data, I know that different industries do this differently, and I'm wondering, is it the way it is done within the open source space, is it a lot different from how it would be done in private industries and all of that?
Well, the standard of data, I could say, to the greater extent looks alike. There are some areas of proprietary labelings which each company may want to protect, but then we have private properties or protected properties such as age, such as gender, such as, let's say, your phenotype or something like that. Why are those properties called like protected properties? Because it has been proven through research that when these properties are exposed and decisions are made upon, it introduce high biases against the people that represent the data. So I don't think if I have, let's say, to hire you in a job or to select you, I don't think knowing your age, knowing your skin color, knowing your gender should be part of the selection process. I understand that for equity, diversity, and inclusion, that's not what we are talking about. If you are qualified, you are qualified irrespective of where you are coming from. And I want to bet you if the right metrics are used across the board, you will see the most qualified people are still, let's say, in their city halls or towns, not even knowing what is happening. A lot of unqualified people have been selected for several reasons and they are occupying top positions. And these are some of the things where we need to keep away those properties, data that are not revealing strength, but they are the way, the protected properties are really well to be kept protected. Besides that, if I conduct, let's say, a research and I really want to ask questions about technical details about certain factors that I'm investigating, I may not want to say I interviewed, let's say, Anita, and Anita said this, right? Because at that point, it is not really the way research is done. We want to apply a kind of blindness, either a single or double blind, depending on how, but in the public view, we will just say participant A said this, and we make sure the identity of that participant A is never revealed when you read the paper or consult the replication package. But there will be one person within the research team who does that mapping. And that person really needs to be ethically responsible, never to reveal that. Because I've conducted a study with one of the brightest brain in AI in the world, and I was a little bit surprised at the point with the responses that some of them gave. I just understand anyway, we are all humans. We may not be at our full potentials the way our CV says. I could not go online and be saying I was surprised this person said that. That's not research. You have to respect, the protocol and the procedure. Try to keep people's personality away from some of those things. And then, so the way research, the data is handled at the level of, let's say, open source must follow the standard of research, which anonymity is of great value, not concealing information, but just protecting people's identity. In the company, they may add one layer let's say if you go to most proprietary company, they may add one layer to protect their, how will you call it, their name, their brand, or whatever, for some other reasons, which sometimes it's okay to understand, but it's just the difference. Open source, you try to protect what research really stands for, but at the same time, you also want to make sure that if a random researcher picks up your work to replicate, they should come to the same kind of conclusion, giving all the variables and the referential framework which you use. Yeah.
Well, that does make a lot of sense. So, have you before published a research work where open source, either the project or open source practices played a crucial role in, coming to a conclusion at?
Yeah. I think one of my first papers, well, not really like the first, but in my PhD thesis, the way I structured it, the first paper was like the paper to investigate onboarding, and the way I took the onboarding paper was to acquire a kind of in-depth information which was quite difficult to obtain from any other proprietary setting. I replicated this work at Microsoft, but at some point I got a lot of pushback because the company has built-in structure. if a work culture, policies and things already set in place, which is above whatever you are bringing in or taking out. Now, that said, you will see that the way open source is conducted, it is easy to invalidate or to verify theories or perceptions from practitioners. I remember when I'm doing, because anyway, let me just give this to link to you. My nature of research is mixed method, which means I follow different, let's say, qualitative, quantitative, and many other sources of data to a single truth. I don't just look at one direction. Now, I interviewed a bunch of researchers at proprietary company, and they told me very formidable things during the interview. Oh, during my first day, 3 days later, my onboarding, I make my first contribution. It took me just some few minutes and this and that. It was so enticing to listen to great brain speaking. But when I consulted the code base now to do a different type of study, like learning actual data from the telemetry data and other sources of data, which you cannot lie, I picked up my biggest surprise because the lowest person spent at least 3 weeks. But the data that they spoke with the interview, nothing came close to that. So sometimes people unintentionally tell lies. I will say it that way. It's a research slogan. People unintentionally tell lies. We keep it that way. We don't just take things where people say and we publish. I've seen as a reviewer myself in top journals, I've rejected a lot of papers that researchers make this mistake. They just come in and say, I interviewed this person and this is for the person. It's like the people that you interview are the ones dictating and writing your papers for you. No, a researcher, you need critical thinking ability. You need to question. You need to say, okay, they said this thing. Are there theories to verify and validate this conceptual understanding of this
Yeah.
fact? When you start looking at things that way, you realize that at some point you start having contrast to popular belief system. And that is where research is, where you can contradict what people think they knew all along as facts. You say, oh no, I found evidence, this thing doesn't hold true. Or I found evidence to support this claim. And that fact must be compelling. That's where research lies. So open source gives a lot of this avenue. And I've seen this kind of contrast throughout my research. As I said, all along my research has really been from my master's degree right up to PhD, has really been with open source world.
Okay. So
Yeah.
with like open source into the picture of like your research work, right? Can you say there is a particular problem that you have been having previously with like your research methods that getting to use or work with open source has made that particular issue a lot easier, or maybe just taking care of that particular issue?
Mm. It will be difficult for me to really compare in a way for one reason. The fact is that the projects that I have worked with that were really like proprietary, the type of data, you may not find them directly on open source equivalent. For example, there was one work we did with observing, like reconstructing accident scenario. We had to plant black boxes on. Then, in terms of there is a crash or something like that, we want to reconstruct the driver's behavior. Was the driver drowsy, drunk, sleeping, texting, and things like that? Up to this present moment, I'm not sure. I mean, that was long ago that we did that project, and we have done something quite similar with pilots to understand certain behavior patterns with whereabouts. Besides this kind of work, I will not say we always have a match from open source and closed source. But in the most part of it, if I were to focus on software ecosystem in particular, the nature of availability of data, transparency is just too commendable. For example, I remember during my master's thesis, I investigated a scenario where we could evacuate a data center by evacuating the virtual machine if there is a natural disaster like earthquake, flood, the kind of strike that suddenly attacks to disrupt a data center. And we know at that point that data center is hosting thousands of virtual machines that are running. We need to evacuate. Now, to decide the where and when that evacuation should happen was a complex problem to solve. Now, collecting data from competitors at that time could have been the Azure, could have been AWS, and the Google Cloud. All of these that I mentioned so far are proprietary. They will not give you accessibility of certain inside of their data set. Fortunately, we have OpenStack Cloud, which was just like as I told you earlier, I could play with the code. I could open the kernel, the hardcore of Nova, of any other project lands to really see how the algorithms were written. And I came up with my own algorithm to implant in the system, and I was able to do the work in a very stellar nature. So at that point, I had also the opportunity to discuss a future of life migration with the community, that, okay, this problem is not something you guys were solving, but I investigated it and this is my solution. I was able to reduce the downtime of, if you understand how life migration works, start copying, at some point it has to shut down the machine, then do the final flip, then start the machine in the other server. If there is anything that disrupt, it rolls back. So in a scenario where we were trying now to evacuate and different scenarios that were happening, I needed some technical form of data that could give me access to the source code and how to compile the system, how the system itself works. So I could now decide what type of data structure I'm using, what kind of algorithm will best. This is something that, I mean, people in the industry could do that if they themselves are the researcher. But for an outsider to see that would really like be impossible. So that is one of the things that open source gave that breakthrough, where it was quite impossible just to have that data and carry out that level of work.
It's interesting. So, are there currently any research work that you're doing within the open source space?
Yes, I have a couple of works that I'm doing with the open source space. I think for now, I have like 4 works, and just as you mentioned earlier at the introduction as well, I am always looking for people who are motivated, self-motivated. Especially my focus right now will be on the global south, because I have seen evidence that we have a lot of smart people within the ecosystems in Nigeria, Cameroon, in Kenya, in many parts of Africa, but they don't have the exposure. They don't have the right mentorship. At some point in time, they just start switching and looking for money, which is a good thing. But there is a path in life where I'm not disrupting anybody to just focus on money, but sometimes ask yourself, what am I bringing like to the scientific world, like innovation? If you sell a brand, people will hunt for that brand and they may look at you. So what I'm just trying to see here, not like to advise people how to go with their life, but that they have so much values that they push forward and become notable people in their domain. But some of them introduce it and disappear. So I look at it and I think the right mentorship was not really done to expose them to certain level where they could really be key players. I've seen this and I keep on seeing it every day, blessed day, that we meet in conferences and other venues. So if I could see young people that would not, I mean, pardon the word young, if I could see people who are starting the journey and they just have a self-motivation, that would be a good place to start pushing them up. Like the question you asked, there is this work I'm doing currently. I will not go so much into a detail, but yeah, my work actually like software ecosystem. I did that already at the level of my PhD. It was to map natural ecology to software ecosystem. And that mapping was really healthy and has been useful in the literature. So besides that, we are doing works now, like the recent work that we just submitted was investigating how hackers, bad actors on machine learning system, we were trying to understand the techniques, the procedures, and the tactics that they are using in different scenarios. So we use what is called graph neural network, an advanced form of graph neural network, to learn on real time how we could predict particular, if you start doing some maneuver, how we could predict on real time that maneuver can lead to catastrophic consequences. We cannot block it up front, or we cannot start addressing it immediately. We have a kind of predictive score that we map all those, because we learn different patterns over time. And as you say, as you ask the question about the currency, I have like 3 works that are currently going on. One is on the aspect of cybersecurity in general. I'll just say cybersecurity for now. The other one was also on how we use the language model for code generation model, and then we attack it with different levels to measure the robustness. And all these are open source models that we are using. And of course, smaller models, because we want to bring these tools accessible for practitioners and people who have low resources. There were other quite of projects that I'm still doing at the open source, which I'm still open up to collaboration in this area, was really like to build a kind of framework within open source community. As I said, I'm not really going so much into the detail of this one right now because it's still at the initial level. If I see people who are contributing, who are enthusiastic about open source world and have a little bit of motivation, or some skills, basic skills, we can pick it up from there, then start building them up. But just to know, I will say over 80% of my work right now is
Oh,
open
that's
source.
interesting. Are there like specific tools that are open source that you find yourself using for most of like this research work?
As I mentioned earlier, the first I will always say it, a lot of people get mad because might be they don't even want to hear that name is Emacs. Emacs is one of the greatest tool you will see out there for doing a lot of
Mm-hmm.
stuff. The org mode, in short, it's an ecosystem that is
Yeah.
very great. Besides being what it is, there are a couple of tools depending on what you are doing. Okay, I'll compare it this way. When we started programming lesson at year one, the first question we were asking our professors at that time was, which programming language is the
Yeah.
best? And I thought we were the only ones asking that question. They told me that they have been answering that question over and over and it keeps on asking, keep on popping up. And the simple truth is that there is no such tool which is the best. There is no such programming language which is the best. What do you want to do will determine which tool to use. Take, for example, if you are going for a wedding, you don't want a cyber truck, well, not a cyber truck, but you don't want a bulldozer to go to a wedding party, right? You may want, might be a Ferrari or something like that, a luxury car. If you are going to a rough or tough roads, you need a car that is tailored for that journey or that kind of landscape. So each tool has a particular purpose and some strength. And if you flip things the opposite way, that tool will become even the worst. Even with statistics, if you abuse statistics, it will be so dangerous. But one of the greatest tools we have in research. So there are a couple of tools, notwithstanding. We see like the PyTorch library, the TensorFlow library, the NumPy plot, and many others, pandas. These are things I use in my day-to-day activities. First, they are open source. If you want to look at the other proprietary editor, even Arrow itself, it's a programming platform. Like you have Python, you have Arrow, you have Julia. Look at this, they're all open source. Take the other side of it, MATLAB. How many people can afford a license of MATLAB? And why would I be stretching myself when I have open source variants which are growing in the faster rate? They have great flexibility. And the beauty in open source is that you can always modify the source code to the source code to update value that you need. I've done that in my researches that I even mentioned to you. And if at the other hand, you see it valuable and ready for consumption, you can contribute it back to the community depending on who is sponsoring your project. Because sometimes the person sponsoring your project may say, we need to keep this private for a while and then we might release it later on. You don't have that flexibility that, but at least you have done something. And so there are a couple of tools, and all those tools, those that I mentioned are great. There are even greater tools depending on what you are doing and the kind of data you are using and the kind of visualization you are also using, interpretation. It really depends on which project you are using.
That does make sense because now talking about some of these non open source projects, I went to check the pricing on how to use one of like the survey tools that I wanted to use for research that wasn't open source. And I was stunned by how much it actually costs. And I just realized that if you're not someone who is like getting a full payment, you may not be able to use some of these platforms.
And even just talked about that, even if you are the richest person on the planet, the benefit of using open source gives you a flexibility that the proprietary software doesn't have. I remember in the early days when we were still in collaborating with our African partners and institutions. I myself, there was a time I could not afford the license of, let's say, Microsoft products. Back then, it was so expensive. People were cracking the code and using it. So, but at some point, when you are changing the system, you said, okay, I can no longer be, this is not something that is ethically correct, you see. But then you turned behind and you saw other projects. I've just forgotten the name of. There was, I think it's Open Office. It has. You may call it crap. You may call it then whatever, but it gives you the flexibility to start building, and now it's growing in strength. And there are so many other variants. So everything now we have as tool in the proprietary, the open source is trying harder to bring that capabilities, uh, bringing it out. And that's just the strength. And then you can now start, when they talk about security, it's something that I'm really passionate about and I've really investigated it a lot. When things are made open source, they become more secure. As contrary to popular opinion, when things are made open source, they are more secure because a lot of people are looking into it. People are investigating from different angles. Even if a bad hacker, a bad actor attacks that system, it is detected by multiple people from different angles. Yeah, I mean, open source is something to consider for so many.
Agree. So when like someone is getting into the research field, like you mentioned earlier, you're looking for people who are motivated to get involved that you can also work with, right? What would you define as success for someone who is getting into the research field but then would want to use open source as an entry point?
I would say the motivation I mentioned early on will be the first thing. And how would that relate to success? In the sense that if somebody comes to me and say, okay, I've been involved with this particular open source project, this is what I have done, and these are the challenges I have faced. And I want to understand how those challenges might mutate over time or change, or just to bring up some challenges. I already see value in those kind of conversation, and we can pick it up from there. Research fundamentally it's frustrating. So when you just mentioned the word success, I shifted. I said, because the biggest researcher will tell you everybody is afraid of rejection. It's very painful, and it is something we see every day.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you will write to the best of your ability, but you will always find somebody in the community who is smarter than you in that particular direction. And when they will look at some errors you've done, they bring it out in a different way of thinking. You will see how sometimes not so smart you were. Then they give you this feedback. It's so painful, but I mean, that's just the nature of the job. It builds you up, and you have to rebuild the work, do the research from some different perspective. You resubmit. So rejection is something that is very common. That is something that people in the other side, let's say industry, might not be comfortable with. So it's a different world. Somebody who wants to do research must be ready for hardcore rejection. Ready not meaning that you are not fighting hard. That's why you even pain more, because you spend sleepless nights. There are times, even at the middle of a night, you have to get, well, it's natural. Most researchers will get up, you start thinking deep, you write down some inspiration that you've gotten, you try to put some, just some things down to jot down your ideas and things like that. Then later on, you realize that all your inspiration that you were working for the past 3 months, 4 months, somebody in India, China, or wherever in the world has already published on that topic. It becomes so frustrating even. Those type of things you should be aware of. I've seen people who have spent 4 years researching on their PhD, 2 weeks to their defense, somebody else published their work. The same kind of contexts and problems they were solving. Very frustrating. Cannot have two similar PhD. It doesn't work. You have to do something to change the topic. You have to do something. So it creates innovation. And this kind of thing, when people are coming, might be people just want to have the experience, the exposure, not going so deep into, which is fine. I have a lot of people who have published papers, even at their undergrad, excellent paper, but they are not researcher like professions. They are still in just contribute. When they speak, that's the difference. When people who observe one data point, to use that data point and tell a long story, they breathe in conspiracy theory so fast. But when somebody with a background in research wants to speak, they are becoming careful how they represent observations to make sure they don't overgeneralize, they don't just take things out of context. That gives a lot of reasonable understanding how we approach our observations. So just to conclude, in this particular point, the best place to start is your self-motivation. Identify the project that you think, to the best of your knowledge, is of interest, because you need to love what you are doing. That's the best reward we have. You have to love it. The reward is never financially satisfied, never. But because I'm talking in comparison to the effort, the time, the sacrifice that you put. If you don't love it, you become so frustrated. Then you always have a way of, meeting with people who are like mind, like you, so you can grow faster with that motivation. So that's just the first thing to do. So success in itself will not be, I have 1 million papers published. No, it's how your values of that motivation aligns. I don't want to talk so much about the process of the research itself because there is a false metrics. People tend to think about people with so many publications as successful researchers. That's a big lie.
So, thank you so much for sharing that. And assuming someone has interest in, let's say, research, but has zero background at all in either open source or research as a whole, but they want to pursue a career moving forward, what would you say they should do?
I will identify that to be myself many years backward. I had zero understanding of my way of thinking was not even in line with some of those things, but I would just say my curiosity was one of the first factors, right? So we always start by onboarding kind of principles. Once that self-motivation is there and you see that person is willing to learn, you start gradually pointing to them things that they could do by virtue of being exposed are already baggages that they are carrying. Sometimes it suffices to point to them that what you are doing is called this in research terms. So I've been doing this all my life without noticing. That's why I use the word mentorship in the first place. Some people just need mentorship to align their thinking, their cognitive thought process to incline towards scientific thought process. And that's it. Then they just pick it up. But first, statistic is something that they really need to be familiar with. How to collect data, just that. I mean, I don't want to use any scary word because most of those things, people do it every day. But when you call the name mathematics, they are scared. So I prefer to start hands-on, building up something. Then when it fails, I ask you, oh, can we find out why we did not have the desired outcome? As we are going backtracking, then we start labeling things. They are already there. Now they themselves will be even much more happier to say, oh yeah, I understand it. Okay, I will do this. At that level, they are more open. They are more in the position where they are substitute to learning. Instead of celebrating their failure or crushing or their failure crushing them, they're at that point of, exploring. Because trust me, I've seen people even in machine learning world, great thinkers, I would say they drop mathematics at very tender age. Now, when they come to a sitting where people with AI backgrounds are talking, and those people start calling names of vectors, of matrices, of these, which those people were not so comfortable with. You scare them even further away. And this method of approaching new people, I don't really appreciate because I have seen people with zero college degree. Some of them are executive in tech companies because they use a different reasoning pathway to obtain the same result. So there are multiple ways of getting there without breaking or bending the rules. And I really reserve this kind of discussion for people who are motivated, as I said. Yeah.
All right. I think that was our last question for today. And thank you so much for this insightful discussion. So I would like you to just give a simple line, for anyone out there who wants to get into research and sees open source as an entry point but does not know how to. Just a word of advice for anyone who is out there watching this.
Yeah. So the first thing I will say is that just pick any paper of your choice, any research project of your choice. See if you can find anything you disagree with the researcher. That will even be a first point because there is no research without limitations. If you are at that point where anything you say, or let's say a research paper says you take it as the gospel truth, then research is not for you. You should be able to say, I don't really agree with this. Just look in any paper of your choice. Try to read through and find a point where you start disagreeing. That is the first good point. Then you are finding a gap to fill, and that is how you can come in to fill that gap. So always try to look for a gap, but not do it as these people are so dumb, it's a crappy work. Appreciate what they have done up to that point, but they have these limitations. It will open you up for you to come in. I have worked, but there are people who will still come up and say, okay, I don't agree with this point. Fine, we all take it one level higher, and that's how the world becomes a better place in research. Nobody is yet there. There are still problems with $1 million awaiting someone who will solve it. Nobody has yet grabbed that money, and there are multiple of projects like that. So the world is open, and open source is really the better place to be to solve some of those problems.
Okay. Thank you so much, Armstrong. This has been so insightful, and I enjoyed every bit of this conversation. So if you're just coming across this session today, we talked about open source in the research space, and it has been so wonderful. So if you've just watched this as well, make sure to hit the like and subscribe, and also share with your friends who would also need this as well. That being said, have a great day, and that is all for today from Open Source Diaries.